Welcome to New Atlas Live. I'm Brian Berletic. Joining me, as always, is Angelo Giuliano, and we have a guest, Danny Haiphong. Hello, Danny. Welcome to the New Atlas Live. I think this is the first time you've been on live.
Yeah,
We don't have many guests, but how are things going there on the East Coast in the U.S.?
it's hot. It's hot, but things are going okay. Things are going okay. The political situation, the geopolitical situation is dicey, but I'm really glad to be with both of you this morning. I hope you all are well.
Yes, and Angelo, how are you doing?
Great. In Bangkok, same as you, and it's we are in the middle of Songkran. Songkran is the water festival. The same. We actually have also the Songkran in China, southern China. So it's fun. It's a nice place to visit. Enjoy it. Really nice.
Yes. And to all my Thai viewers, happy Songkran. I meant to say that before it started last time, but I forgot. So we have a lot to talk about, and I think we should start with Ukraine. We'll talk about China and its role regarding Ukraine a little bit. We'll get into Taiwan, the Dalai Lama, Taiwan separatism, Tibetan separatism, and then we'll finish it off talking about the BBC complaining about being labeled as state media when they absolutely 100% are state media. So let's take a look at this first article. Let me make sure I'm doing this right. This is from ABC Australia, state media. Ukrainian troops withdraw from some areas amid unrelenting Russian attacks on Bakhmut. And we've been talking about this constantly, and we said that this was what was going to happen. It's a heavily fortified city. The fact that Ukraine gave up any ground at all in this heavily fortified city shows that they're stretched, their combat capacity is waning. And now even this, because they're citing British intelligence, that intelligence update that they give, I don't know if it's daily or not, but they've said quite ridiculous things. The fact that they're saying something reasonable actually kind of worries me. Let's start with Danny, and then Angela. What do you think about this? The Western media, Western governments starting to publicly talk about how bleak things are becoming in Ukraine. Oh, Danny, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah, no, it comes in the midst of these Pentagon leaks, and all of them kind of point in the same direction, that there is, whether it's redirection or distraction, there is an attempt to demonstrate maybe more of what people like yourselves and all of us have been saying, which is that Ukraine doesn't really have a chance here. But I think it's interesting, the timing of this, because how many weeks have we heard over and over and over again that Ukraine is going to launch some spring counteroffensive? And it appears that this admission, or these many admissions that are happening, are kind of laying the groundwork for possibly delaying this and delaying this and delaying this for as long as it takes until the collective West is able to muster up some kind of counteroffensive for Ukraine. But I do think the timing is interesting, because there's obviously a level of understanding. It's not just us talking about it. There's definitely an understanding within this war-making class, within the neocon establishment, that this situation, the situation with the war, is not going according to how I think the collective West hoped it would go, since, all the way back to last year. I think they hoped that it was going to be a much quicker conflict, and that was never going to be the case. And now the consequences of that are bearing some fruit.
Yeah. And Angela, I mean, what are the chances that they're looking for an off-ramp, or they're just buying time, or what do you make of this? Why are they suddenly saying things that make sense after over a year of fabrications?
It's hard to say, but I would say probably they're starting to prepare the mind of people that actually it's not what they depicted for 1 year. So you see, the thing is that at some point they don't want overnight the collapse of Ukraine without starting to prepare people. So they need to come up a little bit slowly, gradually, with the truth. Because otherwise, let's say if overnight, they've been telling us that Ukraine was winning the war, And what if overnight Ukraine really collapses? Because there's a probability. We don't know that, but there's a probability. So they need to start preparing people, So they were doing 100% propaganda. Maybe they might start doing a 10% of real news within the 90% or 100% of propaganda.
Well, that's a good point. And what about the possibility that they want to escalate significantly, but first they need to kind of panic the public and say, "Oh no, everything is going bad for Ukraine. Look how bad everything is. So let's get involved even more so." Danny, what do you think about that?
I think it's definitely a possibility. I don't think that the collective West, especially the United States and its foreign policy establishment, has anything with the idea of pulling back. And I don't think that was ever the case for Ukraine, that ever would be the case for Ukraine. They're obviously in this for the long haul. For them, I think it's just a matter of how can they justify it, given that they're going to be pretty monumental and significant defeats and hiccups and just incredible issues with pushing through toward any kind of semblance of victory. I honestly believe the U.S. foreign policy establishment doesn't see victory in its sights. It's just hoping that it can escalate for long enough and keep this conflict going so that it can reap whatever benefits it can from it, including building up towards some kind of capability to confront Russia militarily. But I think that there's many in the foreign policy establishment who knows that's not a quick endeavor. That's not something that's going to be accomplished within, a short amount of time.
Yeah. And Angelo, what about you? Do you think there's a possibility that they're trying to create a window of opportunity to actually escalate this rather than, because I agree that they definitely have to start making that transition into reality so people aren't shocked. But is there a possibility they could also use this as an opportunity to escalate?
What kind of escalations? That's the question. They have depleted. The EU doesn't have any weapons to send. They don't have any more ammunition to send. So what is the escalation? What could it be? The next step is boots on the ground. But next step means, once we're talking about boots on the ground, we are talking about a formal war declaration. That's the next step. So who's willing to do that? Boots on the ground first. I would say probably the Baltic countries and Poland, but the rest of Europe is not going to follow. And we've seen you go with boots on the ground, but what you have to offer more than what Ukraine had. Keep in mind that Ukraine had the best army in Europe, probably after Turkey. So that army doesn't exist anymore. It's going to be exactly the same. Put 200, 300,000 troops coming from Poland. Well, it's going to be demilitarized, slowly grinding, because they don't have much more to offer. I would say that you can correct me here, but I would say that the next stage is probably since they have depleted the armed defense, things could go much, much faster, because once you have air supremacy, then you can do really massive damage.
Yeah, it's a good point. Escalate with what? And the air defense systems are obvious, whether you believe, because this was mentioned in these leaked documents that are out there. They talked about how Ukraine's air defense systems were depleted. But we also already saw this unfolding, because months ago they were talking about sending Western air defense systems to Ukraine. Why would they talk about that? It's not easy to send these. It's not easy to train Ukrainians on them. There's not a huge supply of interceptor missiles for any of these systems. So to take a step like that, the fact that Ukrainian air defenses were heavily depleted, it was obvious. And now I kind of am starting to think that maybe they're pushing Ukraine to do the offensive now, because just as you say, Angelo, once the air defense systems are out completely or to a greater degree, and the Russian Air Force is operating more freely over Ukraine, we heard this term game changer a lot. It actually will be a game changer. It'll be just like in Syria when Russia went in and began bombing the supply lines. Now, Another point I want to make, and this is how I want to segue to this next topic, is they need to save the U.S. and their allies. They need to save their air power for potential war with China. If they get involved heavily in Ukraine, they intervene themselves and they begin expending their air power there, the munitions used with their war plans, that is going to detract from any possible conflict with China. And so let's take a look at this from Al Jazeera. Here we have another European leader attempting to lecture China on how China should handle the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, call on aggressor Russia to end war. Germany urges China. And this is Annalena Baerbock, and she's doing this and apparently oblivious to the fact that China is well aware that they're next. Danny, what do you think about this?
Well, it's quite embarrassing because Olaf Scholz was in China late last year and spoke a very different tune. And of course, this comes on the heels of Emmanuel Macron's recent visit last week, where he essentially ignored the Taiwan question. And this has infuriated the collective West, especially the mainstream media, but especially the U.S. foreign policy establishment is incredibly angry with Macron for not asserting any kind of interest in the U.S.'s Taiwan project. And so Annalena Baerbock appears to be doing some damage control. Her statement in front of Qin Gang, the current Chinese foreign minister, was really embarrassing, because what she essentially committed to was following along with the U.S.'s strategy and saying that an alliance with the United States and not being sort of not playing any kind of middle ground or not taking a position on Taiwan is out of the question, and that Germany really needs to be concerned about China. In China, I mean, this is not diplomatic behavior. Pepe Escobar says it all the time. The U.S. never did diplomacy, and Germany is now just an extension of the United States and is also not doing diplomacy. And it's incredibly stupid in a lot of ways, because Germany is really reliant on China economically, and any kind of escalation with China on the part of Germany will only do more damage. But given what we've learned about Nord Stream and how subservient and absolutely servile Germany has been around that, this does not come as a surprise, especially since Baerbock is the same person who admitted that Germany is at war with Russia when it comes to this Ukraine conflict.
A lot of good points. And if it weren't for the Nord Stream pipelines being blown up, I would have thought for sure Europe was going to resist being dragged into the proxy war with Russia in Ukraine, and I would have for sure been certain that they would not be dragged into any sort of proxy conflict with China. But I agree with you. I don't think so. And you mentioned France and Macron, Angelo Macron. Do you think his trip to China and his comments about not being a vassal of the U.S., is this for real this time, or is this just him doing what he did all the way up until the proxy war against Russia started in Ukraine?
I would love to believe that what he says is right. Really, that could be a game changer. He's actually having the posture of a wannabe de Gaulle, and that could actually completely change the whole game. Because imagine a country which is still quite powerful, a nuclear superpower like France, taking a stance like more balanced stance when it comes to China, where you would have potentially other countries following France. But then I do not trust Macron. Macron is a pure product, globalist product. He's been telling the people, there's a saying in France, we say en même temps. When he came into power, he said, I'm not from the left, but I'm not from the right either. And he was all along like this, trying to please everybody and saying everything and the contrary. He could say the opposite the next day. So here, it is extremely surprising, yes, what he said so far. He kept on saying, when he came back to France, he kept on saying that. It's a big, big question mark. Then when it comes to Germany, I think Germany is more in. It's completely following the US. I don't have much hope. I would say there's probably two. We need to differentiate. There's Olaf Scholz and Baerbock. Baerbock, she's from the Green, extreme Atlantist. I would say Olaf Scholz might be a bit more moderate, but he doesn't have any choices because to maintain the coalition he has, he needs to keep the Green with him.
Absolutely. And I honestly believe that France and Germany are going to disappoint us again. And what I thought was interesting is Baerbock's there lecturing China about sovereignty in Ukraine while the United States is trampling China's sovereignty regarding Taiwan. And I've pointed this out a million times, and I'm going to point it out again before I even open the news story. This is the official U.S. State Department website, U.S. relations with Taiwan. And it says very clearly and unambiguously, it does not recognize Taiwan's independence. Right here, we do not support Taiwan independence. And they talk about a one China policy. And for people who don't know what that is, it means there's only one China. Taiwan is part of it. There's only one government ruling over all of China, including Taiwan. It's the People's Republic of China in Beijing. The US recognizes this. The UK recognizes this. The EU does. And every European country individually does. Australia does. Every nation on earth just about recognizes this. And of course, the UN does. And yet, what do we have? We have this. This is from Radio Free Asia. This is U.S. government media. U.S. House of Representatives introduces its own Taiwan bill. And they're talking about Michael McCall, who said that they'll put boots on the ground over Taiwan, fighting over Taiwan, which the U.S. officially recognizes as Chinese territory. Danny, why don't you start? And what do you think about, first of all, Germany lecturing China about national sovereignty while ignoring the U.S. and also Europe to a degree, trampling Chinese sovereignty regarding Taiwan?
Well, I think it's par for the course. What Angelo said about France and Macron, I think, rings true. And I think Germany is a more extreme case because since the beginning of the Ukraine conflict, Germany has been nothing but subservient to whatever the United States has wanted in that conflict, no matter how much it has hurt Germany. Germany has really been the most affected by all of the sanctions and all of the escalations that have been occurring. But I think it just shows the hypocrisy, really, the hypocrisy of the collective West, because no matter how much they want to talk about Ukraine self-determination, countries like Germany never want to mention how the United States and NATO backed the coup. And that's because they're one of the biggest NATO partners. They were inherently involved in that coup in 2014 in Ukraine. And so it's just more hypocrisy. And I think this is really dangerous for Germany because China is Germany's largest trading partner. And if Germany is going to go the way it has gone with Russia, then, its status as an economic power and also just its stability itself, its political stability, is really at risk. And I think it is one of these cases, I think these historic cases that we're seeing now with all of Europe, which is just more and more shooting itself in the foot. That's really what it is. It's just more and more self-inflicted harm, really needless harm. But when you think about it, it's quite clear that these political operatives don't have any choices. Baerbock is just a political operative of the U.S. neocon and foreign policy establishment. Olaf Scholz is, no matter how moderate he is, he certainly also is more than willing to trade in whatever favor with the United States, regardless of the consequences.
Okay, I was just gonna ask Angelo. Well, I thought it was interesting, Danny. You talked about I was saying about how hypocritical it was for Germany to lecture China about Ukraine because the U.S. and also Europe are undermining Chinese sovereignty regarding Taiwan. But you brought up the fact that Ukraine hasn't had any sovereignty since 2014. The U.S. Overthrew the government and installed a client regime in its place. And since then, they have had no sovereignty. And so it's impossible for someone to violate sovereignty that does not actually exist. Angelo, Europe is, I think, also playing a role in undermining Chinese sovereignty regarding Taiwan. So they're lecturing China about Ukraine. What has the European Union, what have they been doing, or an individual European country maybe France or Germany, what role have they played in encouraging what is essentially separatism on the island province of Taiwan?
Well, it's interesting that Germany, a country like Germany, is talking about sovereignty. Germany hasn't had any sovereignty since World War II. So you have it's still occupied. We know that there are, I don't know, 20, 30,000 US Army troops on the ground. And so the rule of the game were imposed, their constitution was imposed by the US so they could control Germany. So what we saw in this war, since the Ukrainian war, was that actually you have European countries that actually have given up their sovereignty to the EU, which, by the way, the EU was a CIA-US project. It's really important to understand that. The first who was behind that was Jean Monnet and Walter Alstein. They were CIA on the payroll of the CIA. And the idea was to dilute all the nation states and basically destruction of those nation states and to create a dictatorship in Brussels. A dictatorship, very similar to what you have in the US, thousands of lobbyists controlling politicians which, by the way, are not elected by European people. So what we saw here was that actually it highlighted that, and it highlighted that the EU is subservient to the US. So, and it's very interesting what we saw in Macron. Did you see Macron had planned this trip to China? And then von der Leyen, she insisted on joining. She insisted on joining, and which, it would be unthinkable if it was the goal, the EU. Actually, if the goal was still alive, France would have left the EU because the goal didn't want that, The goal accepted to be in the EU just because France back then was even more powerful than Germany because Germany was not united. So the goal accepted to be in the EU because he knew he could play a very strong role. So I think it is just ridiculous for those countries to talk about sovereignty. And you see the treatment they had. There was two different treatment because China knows that the EU is an extension of the US. So you had two treatment. You had the treatment of von der Leyen and Macron. Von der Leyen, she had to go through the customs like average Joe, a huge humiliation. She had to take the train. Like average Joe, it was not the treatment they did on Macron. And I think what China is maybe trying to do is maybe trying to divide. I mean, that's the only way it can win. They have to go this way. They will need to divide Europe, and maybe they're taking apart, maybe France. But they need one major country. It could be either France or Germany. If they have them on board, it changes completely. And you see how many shifts they've done so far. Shifts that we didn't believe could happen. We saw Turkey shifting. We saw India shifting. India, which is supposed to a China enemy, but somehow it's siding with the multipolar world. More shifts. With more shifts, we might actually get to the tipping point. This tipping point where slowly, you have followers and then everything overnight changes. And with the pain of Ukraine, as time passes by, we see that, European countries, they have only so much they can put into this. And people, they don't want, if you ask Europeans, the mood is shifting. It was cool, at the beginning, they thought, oh, it's attacked and so on. Now they're learning that they are financing Nazi regime, a drug addict, which is at the head of Ukraine, someone that doesn't care about Ukraine. So people are waking up.
Yes. So we see this happening. Danny, you mentioned that Europe is hurting themselves with the proxy war against Russia, but now also this situation with China. China is the largest trade partner for many nations around the globe, up there, and probably the top three for most European countries. And so if they're already suffering because of the sanctions they attempted to impose on Russia, And what is the next logical step? Where's the U.S. going to push Europe next? And if, as Angelo is saying, the leadership in Europe does not represent European best interests, so what's going to happen to Europe if they keep going down this path alongside the U.S. in this proxy war? And I just want to show how serious this is. We talked about McCall talking about boots on the ground in Taiwan. Angelo, you pointed this out right before we started. China-Taiwan conflict, 25 U.S. defense contractors to visit Taiwan to discuss joint production of drones and ammo. And this is just a verbatim repeat of what the U.S. did to Ukraine from 2014 onward. Where is this going to drag Europe, Danny?
I think it's going to drag Europe into economic crisis and political instability, what we've already kind of seen a taste of over the course of the Ukraine conflict. You already hear EU leaders talk about, for example, Josep Borrell talk about things like sanctions on China. Should China arm Russia? And Baerbock it was kind of intimating that indeed China may support Russia in the future. And these leaked documents actually accuse, the Pentagon leaked documents actually accuse China of already doing so indirectly. But as you both are probably aware, they make these kind of suggestions that certain Chinese commodities and products that are exported to Russia help with the production of certain weapons, or China's trade with Iran then helps with the production of drones that are used by Russia, Iranian drones that are used by Russia and Ukraine. So I do think that there is going to be a huge push to economically bring Europe more and more down the path of decoupling. And I think that's what made Emmanuel Macron's trip so infuriating. And the optics were really interesting about that trip, because you were talking about some of it, Angelo, with the train ride for Ursula. But there was also a clear boundary drawn, a line of demarcation, that there would be no joint meetings between all three of them. There would be no pictures taken, right? So altogether, every conversation that was had was done separately. So Ursula met with Chinese leaders, and then Macron met with Chinese leaders, but they never came together. And I think that on the one hand, Europe was trying to be, the EU is trying to be a little strategic about how it wanted to present itself. But I also think on the Chinese side, there was a lot of caution about making it look like the European Union was ganging up on China publicly, because for one, that was really all Ursula's visit to China with Macron was about. It was about holding Macron's hand and hoping that he wouldn't say the wrong thing. It didn't work, because I don't think anyone really recognizes Ursula von der Leyen or any of the EU's top brass as legitimate diplomatic partners at this point, and legitimate representatives of any kind of legitimate entity on the world stage. And so China definitely did not want to be seen as being bullied. And even Macron decided to go off script, especially on Taiwan. But this idea of strategic autonomy now has the EU kind of split, because today I believe the president of the European Council, Mr. Michel, came out and said, yeah, we're for strategic autonomy. Perhaps it is smart not to follow the US. So there are these breaks, but they can't be trusted, because just like Macron, he's an investment banker, worked at like the Rothschild and Schwab Bank. You know, he is a neoliberal through and through. He has, despite all of his rhetoric, right, throughout the Ukraine conflict, I know, Brian, we've talked about this. Macron has talked about, being a mediator in Ukraine and trying to take an independent position. But what has France done? I mean, some of these leaked documents show that there are French special operations forces operating in Ukraine. It's not as if they're not a party to all of the aggression that the United States has been leading the collective West along. And so it isn't to be trusted. But I think we are going to see more political instability. They're already predicting it in the Pentagon, because these leaked documents show that Ukraine's political situation could very well get really bad very soon. But I think Europe, we're seeing it too, where with the protests in France, and, you know, I know Germany's had unrest. We've seen the Czech Republic. We've seen so many countries kind of rise up. People rise up and say, no, we don't want just unlimited funding and unlimited war from NATO. And I think that's what's coming. And I think the EU is definitely going to try to tighten up its economic warfare toward China, to try to show that it's tough. When that will happen, how that will happen, unsure yet because there's so many different areas it could try to target, but it will only end up going badly for Europe and its economy.
Yeah, I think so too. And well, you mentioned how France and other European nations have gone along with the U.S. on everything: Iraq, Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, and all of these conflicts, as we've talked about many times before. This was all part of a single agenda to encircle and contain both Russia and China. And so they have been accomplices all the way up until now. But as Saudi Arabia is on the path to demonstrating, it doesn't have to be like that forever. And I guess that's why I want to kind of focus on this. We see what's happening over Taiwan, how it's really heating up. The U.S. really wants to precipitate some sort of conflict that is going to force the Europeans to get on board with sanctions. Angela, what do you think is going to happen if the United States and Europe decide to put Russian-style sanctions on China? How is that going to turn out? I mean, look what already happened with Russia. I mean, I can't even imagine what will happen if they try to repeat this with China.
Well, we saw how it damaged, especially European economies when it came to Russia. You have to multiply this probably by 10. There's one thing is probably China, when it comes to sanctions, they are in a much stronger position than the collective West. China now, if he doesn't trade with the collective West, is pretty much self-sufficient. What does China need from the collective West? It needs its market. But you see, European economy, the US, now with the declining position of the US dollar, it is, China needs to shift its economies, its partners. And it has started, actually. South America, Africa have become like very big partners. So it has diversified. Now, if the collective West doesn't trade with China, well, many things that China does, other countries don't do. Rare earth, for example, China has a monopoly there. And then if they find new suppliers, it's going to be much more expensive because China is still a cheap place. It's a very highly productive. It's not cheap, but because of productivity, it makes the product very cheap. So Europe has already inflation problems. You are not going to shift overnight suppliers. It doesn't work like this. Lots of products you need there's a lag time. You need there's a huge setup cost. Set up a factory. Well, they tried semiconductors. They tried to transfer some semiconductors factories to Arizona. How much did they put there? Tens of billions of dollars, and now they realize it's not going to be possible. Probably not easy, but it's going to take much more time, and maybe not even possible to get to the same level of what Taiwan is doing. So I think there's lots of words there, but not very realistic. So again, it's shooting themselves in the foot.
Yes.
I just want to add one more thing. Just when it comes to, there's one point that I think it's really important. They want to frame China as being co-belligerent when it comes to Russia and Ukraine conflict. I think China would go to very, very large extent just not to be co-belligerent, not to sell weapons to Russia. First of all, Russia probably doesn't need it because it has a huge military industrial complex. It doesn't need China. What China is providing here is ways to bypass sanctions, and they're committing to buy lots of Russian products so it can sustain Russian economy. But just think about it. China wants to promote this multipolar world, which is going to be non-interference, live and let live. So if you want to start that would be a very bad example just to support militarily Russia. So it would just go through such an extent, and we see the what is happening in Ukraine. We don't, unless Europe gets suicidal, the collective West gets suicidal, they're not going to win. So China is pretty much safe. But again, it's the collective West wants to frame China as co-belligerent. China will not. That's not the purpose. China, what is China doing right now? It's making peace. Yemen is going to be a brokered peace agreement by China because of China. They're putting Saudi Arabia, Iran around the table. That's what they want to show, and that's only the tip of the iceberg. Once there is a multipolar world, you are going to see many wars ending, including the Palestinian issue. Everything is going to be solved. You know why? Just look at every single conflict you have around the world. You have always one side, and very often it's the minority, it's the smaller side, which is supported by the collective West. Why? Because it's the divide and control strategy. Once the collective West cannot play this role and cannot finance all those NGOs, NEDs, and so on, then you have countries that are not going to be so emboldened. They'll be like, you know what? Let's solve locally. So they are going to solve locally problems. Neighbors, I can understand not interference, but countries, neighbors coming at the help. And that's what we saw. We saw what happened in Kazakhstan. It was a beginning of a country like Russia saying, well, you know what, color revolution, those coups won't happen again, because it goes in contradiction with the UN Charter. No interference, and China is going to be about this. Live and let live, and number one, every time, country sovereignty.
Yes.
It's not about ideology. We go back over and over. Not about ideology. Ideology is wrong. It's wrong. If you respect the country's democracy, let them protect their sovereignty, and ultimately they'll find their own system.
Well, you brought up a lot of good points, but I just thought maybe China could use this as a workaround. Maybe they could just lend weapons to Russia, like South Korea is doing for the United States, because their legal system prohibits them from sending weapons to an active conflict. So they said, well, we're just going to lend some artillery shells, just 500,000 artillery shells to the United States, and then after a while, they'll send them back or something. It's obviously this is what the West is constantly doing, and I think Angelo made a very good point about how China doesn't want to simply replace the West and continue doing business like that. They're working on something much bigger. Angelo also talked about China needing to develop markets elsewhere, to diversify away from the US and Europe, who seem determined to destroy themselves. And isn't that the whole point? And maybe we could talk about this, Danny. The Belt and Road Initiative. People keep saying, this is debt trap diplomacy. They don't care about these countries. When you realize how important it is for them to expand markets elsewhere, you realize that this is almost a matter of self-preservation, to do a legitimate process of development in these nations, to develop their economies so that they can become larger, more efficient markets, so that they can help China. And obviously China is helping them. How do you see that? Do you see that as part of the motivation for the Belt and Road Initiative, Danny?
Oh, for sure. I mean, when I was in China and asked people about it, there was an incredible pragmatism to something like the Belt and Road Initiative. Indeed, China has principles and China has values, and many of them stand in complete distinction to the collective West. But a lot of the values that China adopts now, especially globally in how it conducts economic and political and diplomatic relations, really just reflect what the UN Charter says about how you do these things. And the Belt and Road Initiative is no different. But some of the pragmatism here is just that China's economy has grown incredibly fast. It is really huge. And there are sectors in China's economy that are bloated, that grew a little too fast and need relief through foreign investment. And that's what a lot of the Belt and Road Initiative is also all about. It's about opening up relief in gateways and pathways to the European market, to the global market, to make it more efficient, and also to clean up what some of the waste, I think, in what can happen with a foreign investment, including what happened with China. Is sometimes, when you have laissez-faire economies, some folks like to go off and do their own thing and do their own business elsewhere, and with no benefit to the national interest. And China has done, especially in the era of Xi Jinping, a really immense job in tackling corruption. And the Belt and Road Initiative, because it is mainly state-directed, of course, with the help of the private sector, it is all about modeling the relationships that China would like to see all over the world, and that much of the world has embraced. I mean, it's more than 140 countries. It's more than a couple of thousand projects either completed or underway or in the planning process. And all of the countries that have partnered with China, for the most part, are underdeveloped countries, are poor countries, are countries that have long histories of understanding what it's like to follow the United States, follow the collective West down their path of economic relations, which is based on zero sum and based on the notion that one party should dominate and the other party should suffer the consequences of that domination. And China does it completely different. So the values that China holds, I was thinking about this too, is that a lot of the ways that China has conducted projects like the Belt and Road Initiative reflects this, as you were saying, Angelo, like ideology can be really poisonous. And during the Cold War, regardless of whatever we thought about which side had the correct values, the U.S. and the collective West was really able to weaponize ideology against socialism and communism and attempt to delegitimize whatever independence movements were arising all over the world. And I think the way China adapted through this like hide your strength and bide your time mentality that Deng Xiaoping initiated, it was to integrate China while also ensuring that China's sovereignty was protected and that it could adhere to its own values, but that there would never be any more impression from here forward that China was trying to export any kind of model. And that has become so attractive to the global South, because after the fall of the Soviet Union, all the global South has known is imposition and projection of ideology, economic system, political systems onto them from the outside, from the collective West. So I think China is just doing what's really smart here and assuming leadership de facto just by example, just by leading by example. And now countries like Saudi Arabia, something that maybe we wouldn't have even thought of 2 decades ago, Saudi Arabia deciding to diversify its own political and economic portfolio based upon just how influential China has become. And of course, Russia has to be included in that as well.
A lot of good points. And it all comes down to purpose-driven policy and projects versus purely profit-driven. And you'll notice that China is pursuing a foreign policy driven by an actual purpose, not just wealth and power. They're also getting wealth and power as a consequence, but it's much more measured and constrained and in proportion, proper proportions that you would expect to have. And we said we were going to do questions and answers. We never do it, like every single live stream. But they were talking about on the Duran, and people don't have to feel guilty if you want to go over and watch the Duran. That's okay. We could catch this one later. But so why does the U.S. want to destabilize Thailand? It goes right back to the Belt and Road Initiative. China is literally changing the face of the world with its Belt and Road Initiative, its cooperation with all of these other nations. Countries like Thailand, despite Cold War myths, it has an extremely close relationship with China, largest trade partner, investor, source of tourism. They're building a high-speed rail link from Bangkok to China through Laos. The high-speed rail line in Laos is already completed. And Danny, you were just talking about how the rest of the world there used to the West basically just squatting on them. And Laos is a perfect example of this. During the Vietnam War, the U.S. dropped more bombs on Laos than there are people. And even to this day, there are more unexploded ordnance in Laos than actual human beings living there. And as a matter of fact, the high-speed rail line through Laos was delayed because China had to sit there and clean it up because no one else did it. The U.S. pays lip service, says that they are, but the rate that they're demining and dealing with this, it'll be hundreds of years in for all practical purposes, forever. It'll never be done. So this is the difference between how China is running their foreign policy and how the U.S. has demonstrably run its foreign policy. And I kind of want to pivot toward, and I'll let you start first, Angelo, toward this process of interference. So we're talking about Thailand. The U.S. wants to destabilize Thailand. There's a rational government in power trying to balance Thailand's foreign policy. They want the opposition in power who has been propped up by the U.S. and they'll do to Thailand what the regime in Kiev did to Ukraine and everywhere else the U.S. goes. So let's talk about Tibet, because Tibet was in the news here recently. And here's the BBC. And Dalai Lama defended over tongue-sucking remark. And I feel like I have to take a shower just reading the headline. This is someone the CIA has literally built up over decades. People are like, no, he's not. He's the real deal. He's not. We have from the State Department's official website, Tibetan operations, CIA Tibetan activity. This is dated 1964, just to give you an idea of how long this is going on. And so there was political action, propaganda, paramilitary activity, which means giving people guns to kill people. And so the Dalai Lama got caught doing something extremely perverted, basically sexual assault on this little boy. And we see the West defending him. Angelo, what does this tell us about the principles the U.S. has or doesn't have, and how they just kind of use these incidences if they're convenient and bury them when they're not?
Well, I don't know if all of you know about this. We've seen the news on Twitter and so on, but it's not, at least back home in Italy, Switzerland, it's not mainstream news. But so the Dalai Lama was caught kissing a kid on the lips, and then he was trying he asked the kid to suck his tongue. So that's quite shocking. In most countries around the world, you go to jail for that. Actually, including India. In India, you go to jail for that. It's molestation. You don't do that. And they're trying to spin this as being overnight. There's a new tradition in Tibet. They have to find something. It's like family, and it's like it's playful.
In addition to torture, murder, and slavery, other time-honored Tibetan traditions under the Dalai Lama.
Right. So it's quite disgusting how they spin that, just because they build up this image of a living sane divinity and so on, and which is completely fake. There's a tradition. Even the reincarnation of the next Dalai Lama, they decided that he will actually bear a U.S. passport. That is completely so they're destroying completely the movement. It's going to be just a Hollywood movement. So I'm speechless when I see that. But again, this. I think here the collective West is actually showing how some part of decadence. It's extremely decadent, and we saw this. This is what we see in front of people. I'm just asking myself what happened behind closed doors. There's probably much more to that. And pedophilia. It's huge. It's huge in many countries. We saw. Epstein was it might be even a small one, but we saw in France. In France, you have politicians like Cohn-Bendit. Cohn-Bendit is a politician. He's in the EU. In an interview, what he said? He said, but that's a long time ago. That's 20, 30 years ago. He claims that he had sex with kids. He loved 10 years old kids, undressing him, touching him, and so on. He's a politician. So this problem of pedophilia, it's a big problem, and they're closing an eye because people of power, that's what they do. When you have power, money, well, you just push the extreme, and they want to impose upon us, a world which is, some might call it decadence. And that's this whole movement, LGBT and so on. On the surface, it looks cool, but it's actually a dividing issue. It's not inclusive. And they're adding stuff to this. They just legalized zoophilia in Spain. And we call this progressive. And what shocks me is that, sometimes the self-proclaimed leftists, they embrace those causes, but it's decadent. It's actually a manipulation. It's not about progress here. We need to look at the trend and what they want to impose upon people. It's not inclusive. On the opposite, you are going to divide people, and that's what that's what I want to point out here. And we see, when you are permissive on what happened on the Dalai Lama, then what's next? What is next?
Yes. And it's interesting because if you look at say the cultural war in the West, they don't really give you the option of being reasonable somewhere in the middle. You either have to hate all these people and want them all dead, or you want these people to be allowed to do anything that they want, no matter how wrong, including the Dalai Lama. Danny, what is your take on the Dalai Lama? This massive hypocrisy, and I want to touch on this a little further. Here's the BBC. Basically, this is an article apologizing for all of this. There's no serious condemnation here. Versus Global Times, which is Chinese state media, and they're wholly rejecting this, and they're saying this is a symptom of this fake image, this fake heroism that the Dalai Lama's had created for him by the CIA. Danny, what is your take on all that and the disparity between the coverage?
Yeah, well, I mean, on this question of like cultural issues or like LGBTQ issues, what always strikes me is that when they're confined to the establishment, which is how most people consume these issues or delve into them, they're always redirected against the entire society, so against the interests of the vast majority. And none of the legitimate problems that occur within these countries are ever really addressed in any kind of legitimate way that makes really any difference to most people. And that's always what's striking. And this is no different, because what's so just absolutely absurd. It's hard not to laugh at this, because this is just such an emblematic example of how what the United States does around the world, how it has supported opposition movements like this, always does come back in some form to backfire. Because, I mean, the war that the US attempted to wage to take Tibet from China after 1949, right? It took 10 years for China to consolidate the Tibet region, because of the lamas and where the Dalai Lama comes from, were receiving millions of dollars from the CIA to wage a dirty war inside of Tibet to protect what was an aristocracy that tortured children, sexually abused children. The Buddhist teachers in the monasteries where they were hiding all the weapons, they were employing these same, like, they were doing a lot worse than what the Dalai Lama suggested he wanted this child to do to him. And these are the kind of people that the CIA protects, because as long as you're useful, and to be honest, it's hard to even understand why the Dalai Lama or the so-called Tibet opposition movement is even useful at this point. But I think it goes back to, I know you both talk a lot about color revolutions, and if any one of these dominoes were to be delegitimized, then what already is a pretty weak project, I mean, Hong Kong was soundly defeated. The Xinjiang issue has essentially been made completely and utterly ridiculous and exposed as such. And now with Tibet, I mean, it's quite obvious that China has already consolidated Tibet and really integrated Tibet into its national project. And there's no reversing that trend. But regardless, if any one of these weapons for the United States is to be delegitimized, then the entire project is at risk. And I think that's why you see all of this defense of the Dalai Lama. And I grew up in the Northeast. I grew up in a city in the Northeast. And I got to say, there's a lot, the Tibet opposition movement, they come to the Northeast. They live here. And, it's quite clear just how much support they've received to be kind of the useful pawns of the United States' war on China, because they have received so much privileges for doing such a thing. And the Dalai Lama gets to live very high and very well in India after making, what was it, 180,000 per year, just to continue on this ridiculously useless and utterly unsuccessful campaign to try to rip Tibet away from China. So it is really truly disgusting, and it just goes to show how far the U.S. and its allies will go to protect even the most, what I feel like are marginal projects at this point, because there's just absolutely no hope for the U.S. and its allies to get anything out of the Tibet issue other than propaganda talking points and scoring some points in its larger war.
Yes, absolutely. And I want to point something else out. When the West comes together and tries to defend the Dalai Lama for something that's entirely indefensible, all this does is give more ammunition to extremists on the other side who have zero tolerance or empathy for people who have whatever their personal issues are. And it almost vindicates in their own mind that, all of this tolerance, human rights, all of this is nonsense, because look at how they're defending some guy who did something totally indefensible. And I don't know if people saw this on Twitter, this Oslo Freedom Forum. I've talked about the Oslo Freedom Forum. It is US government funded, and the BBC even did a short video on it where they said they come here, they train to overthrow their country, and then they go back and that's what they do. And the Hong Kong mobs, we all know, were funded by the US. They trained at the Oslo Freedom Forum and they went back. And so here's some lady speaking for Tibetans. She's got a North American accent. I believe she's based in Canada. And she's talking about repression in Tibet. And I showed the document. Where was it? I don't know. I talked about the US backing, the CIA backing Tibetan rebels, terrorists. And this continues to this day. So this is the NED, US government, NED. And if you look through the names of these organizations, this has nothing to do with human rights, okay? It has nothing to do with human rights. And if you look at the names of some of these, the International Tibet Network or the Students for Free Tibet, and you go to their websites and you read it, they talk about separatism, creating an independent Tibet. It's occupied by China, they claim, and they want independence. So this is the US government funding separatism, again, in absolute violation of the UN Charter, and this is what this is who they're defending right here. The Dalai Lama, the head of all of this thing that they've been doing since the 50s. This is what it's all about. So it has nothing to do with religious freedom or the poor Tibetans. And the Dalai Lama is just another example of the type of people that gravitate to the U.S. and its schemes. We have Nazis in Ukraine. We have terrorists all over the Middle East, in Syria especially. So it's just an endless cycle. And the thing I want to ask you both real quick before we wrap up, because we're coming up to the hour. So we saw the BBC apologizing for the Dalai Lama, and now it's complaining that it's being slapped with the government-funded label on Twitter, as if. Why would they do that? Why would they defend the Dalai Lama? We see that he's a component for regime change and separatism in China. It has nothing to do with human rights. And so why would they object to being called state-funded media, unless it's just to hide the fact that they're state-funded media there? So Angela, why don't you start? What is with the BBC and also PBS and NPR all complaining about the state-funded label?
Well, because it exposes the fact that they are not independent. They have to follow the propaganda, the government agenda. So they are, they're just speaking on behalf of the government for a geopolitical agenda. So that's the reason. But I mean, who would actually go against that, against this narrative? I mean, if you are from Great Britain, everybody knows that it's because they're paying I don't know what's the fee's name, but everybody has to pay that, and it's state controlled. So it's just embarrassing. But again, it's just if you speak to many English people, they will tell you that they used to have a huge respect to when it came to the BBC. But nobody has any respect anymore. And you see the lots of surveys when it comes to media in general. Just in the West, people do not believe the media. At least in some places, maybe in Russia, the difference is that if there is propaganda, they know it's propaganda. In the West, people they don't even know. They are just eating propaganda all day long. But there's no trust. Again, I look at simple data when it comes to trust towards the media, trust towards the government. We are at the range of 30 to 40%. When it comes to media and government in the collective West. When it comes to government, Russia 80%, China 95%, media probably much higher when it comes to China, because China, I've been listening to Chinese media for a long time. There's one very big difference that China does. They report the news, but they don't tell you how to think. Meaning, really, every single media, they are not going, but this is very cultural. In the West, we need to know who. It's got to be white or black. Who's the bad guy? Who's the good guy? It's like Hollywood movies. How is the good guy? No, well, you get the news in China. They give you the news that's factual. Well, make up your own mind. Just think up for yourself. But they're not going to tell you who's the good and bad guy, unless someone is cutting the head of someone, and they're going to say, well, that might be a bad guy.
Might be a bad guy. Yeah. Danny, so again, the BBC, and I've heard this argument, this drives me crazy. The argument is, well, no, the people are paying this TV license fee, so it's not government funded. And the BBC is also saying this is their argument. But in reality, the government is enforcing this. They're collecting it and giving it to the BBC. So not only is the BBC state funded, I want to point this out too. The Grey Zone did an excellent article. This was a while ago. Reuters, BBC, and Bellingcat, they were all caught taking British government money to do an information operation against Russia. And they're saying it's not government funded because it's the TV license fee. But in reality, all they're doing is kind of laundering it in a way, but actually isn't all government funding collecting some sort of fee or tax and then giving it to whatever. So again, common sense. And then also the BBC is not only government funded, state funded media, but now they're trying to lie about it on top of it all. So it's indicative of everything that they have always been doing. They lie about everything, including what they are and how they operate. Danny?
Yeah, it's pretty absurd. I mean, we all know, I believe, about Operation Mockingbird conducted by the CIA. That was essentially institutionalized across the collective West media after it was formally outed. I mean, this is, even regardless, if the BBC was a private company, 100% through and through, what didn't have any public funding or government funding, it's the way that it operates. It's what service it provides. It's how it conducts its so-called journalism. It's just an embedded institution. It really is just an extension of the UK and, of course, the US's foreign policy establishment at this point. But what's so just, I think, infuriating about this too, just what's so ridiculous about it and just so absurd, is that the BBC objected to what already was a tepid label. They were called government funded, while Chinese media, Russian media, Iranian media, they all get the state affiliated type. So there already was a qualitative difference in those labels. One saying you're government funded doesn't necessarily have the same definition and connotation or implications as being state affiliated. So Chinese media, Iranian media, Russian media all still got to look like they're just some kind of agents and dictators of Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. But BBC just got a small label of being government funded, which is factual. Now, I just read this morning that Elon Musk has caved to this and now is calling BBC publicly funded media. So that's how much influence also the Western mainstream media has, is that it's itself a lobby organization. It itself is a power broker within the political establishment across the collective West, and it influences institutions, huge mega corporations like Twitter, to change its behavior based on its shallow and narrow interests to keep a propaganda war going. Because that's really what they're objecting to. They're objecting to any kind of challenge to the propaganda war, any kind of parody in the propaganda war. Now you can't even have a label that's relatively accurate. Publicly funded government funded media, it's accurate. The British government does fund BBC. It's ridiculous to say it doesn't. But because that adds a little bit of parity to this whole state affiliated media attack on China, Russia, Iran, and Venezuela and other countries, that in and of itself is enough for the Western mainstream media to absolutely lose their minds over this. And to me, it's just so absurd. And it just goes to show what role what Western mainstream media really plays. It's not to inform us, it's to deceive us and to normalize and sanitize what the foreign policy establishment wants to do around the world.
Well said. And I mean, isn't that the whole point with the BBC? It doesn't even matter whether they were funded by the government or not. What is their role? Who is cheerleading the war, the invasion of Iraq, the WMD lies? It was the BBC. And I've seen people say, well, you can't compare the BBC to RT. You're right, you can't, because Russian state media called out the lies about WMDs. The BBC was there cheerleading, and they've done the same thing ever since. A lot of excellent points there. Angelo, you have any final thoughts on this or anything else?
Well, you mentioned RT. It was interesting. I followed very closely the Yellow Vest movement in France. And you know how RT became really, really big was because RT was the only one to follow doing live streaming on this movement, which was massive. People got really frustrated. There was not a single channel, French media, that was covering the Yellow Vest. RT did it, and it became actually the most influential media in France until they closed it. And in qualitative, actually, you know, I haven't seen much restriction. You see people randomly on RT like criticizing, you know, being not necessarily pro Russia. So it's interesting. Actually, we tend to, you know, the collective West tend to say this propaganda Russia side. I think it's way more. We are in the West way more. We have much more propaganda in general. You know, you see actually on Russian channels, you have openly people criticizing Putin. That happened. I don't see much. In the collective West mainstream media.
Yeah, that's also a good point. Even the Telegram channels, which are, you know, more or less independent media, they're pro-Russian, but they criticize Russia. In the Ukrainian, pro-Ukrainian, they're in a fantasy world, and it's very regimented. If you step out of line even a little bit, you might find yourself on a kill list. Danny, do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Yeah, no, I mean, just to extend on to what Angelo was saying, it truly is just a matter of how the collective West media plays its role on the world stage, and the fact that it can still attempt, right? The BBC is attempting to salvage some kind of journalistic identity, while at the same time being one of the main arbiters and agents for the prosecution and persecution of Julian Assange. And, you know, going along with British intelligence, U.S. intelligence, in its real persecution of journalists through, you know, whether it was the Obama administration, Trump, Biden, their war on whistleblowers, what's going on with Assange and Snowden and all of that. I mean, all of this bluster and hubris around, well, we're actually independent. We're really independent. We're not just some government mouthpiece. It's just pure, not only hypocrisy, but it just exposes how much they really are mouthpieces of these governments. I mean, it's astounding that more and more what we're seeing, I think, when it comes to just how delicate and chaotic and crisis-ridden this political situation worldwide is you see in the geopolitical situation worldwide is you see every reaction from the collective West, whether it's media or it's you know, foreign policy brass, what we're seeing, we're constantly seeing these like admissions. Even when they're trying to state an opposite position, if you're just a thinking person, you can see. If you think at all a little critically, you can see exactly what they're actually saying. They're actually saying that they are these mouthpieces of the war machine and of a war machine, and they're just trying to distance themselves from it. And it's just so obvious the more and more these kind of antics go on, and they'll continue because the propaganda war only gets more and more shallow and debased as time goes on against countries like Russia and China and the multipolar world. It just gets more and more absurd, and the more absurd it gets, the more ridiculous and absolutely pathetic, honestly, the collective West looks. And it's only going to hurt the global reputation of countries like the UK and the United States for conducting itself in this manner. And I think that's one of the most important points, is seeing the isolation happen in real time on the information realm, the economic realm, political realm, all of it. It's the isolation is only going to intensify the more that the collective West thrashes about to try to maintain the supremacy that it thinks it can hold on to forever.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. They're isolating themselves. There was a point that I wanted to make. I didn't drink a cup of coffee before I got started here. Danny, you were talking about BBC having a meltdown over this and how serious they got over this seemingly tiny issue. But they know that all of the so-called legitimacy that they have is an utter illusion. It is a smokescreen. There is no substance, zero substance. And they know that if it starts with this label, it will not stop until that whole smokescreen is blown away by the wind of truth. And so that's why they fought tooth and nail. That's why PBS and NPR, whatever it's called, this is why they're literally going to leave Twitter, because they cannot allow this to stand. They have to stop this before it goes too far and everyone starts waking up. Because when people wake up, they don't go back to sleep. You can trick people for quite a while, but when they wake up, they don't go back to sleep. And I guess that's kind of what all three of us here are attempting to do, wake up people as much as possible. I want to thank you, Angelo, as always, for joining me on your Friday evening. Thank you, Danny, for joining us on your Friday morning. And it was a great conversation. We're definitely going to have to do this again. I want to thank everyone who tuned in live. Please check the video description below. All of Danny's information everywhere you can find and follow his work is there. Also, Angelo, also all of my different accounts and everything. So thank you again. And until next time, bye for now.